Okay, in this video we're going to talk about the new Arboreal Node, which is in 1.3.1 as Bleeding Edge. And you can play with this right now. It seems fairly stable. The version on a whole, I mean, not just the node. And it comes with a lot of different features that will give you something that you can use to sort of simulate trees from a distance. But not just that, this can also output maps for you to use to place trees in other applications. Say like using Maya, you could be using MASH, or maybe XGen, to be able to place a number of trees in your terrain. Or in something like Unreal, you might be using the foliage tool, and then you want to be able to like auto paint maps via the landscape painting tools maybe. And you can output a mask that will allow you to very quickly paint those sections. So you get a nice preview in here to see what that's going to look like. And then of course you just output your landscape as is, and then you output your maps for painting that density. So as far as a preview, it can also be used for things that are seen at a distance, and where you see it, on distant objects. You put some atmosphere in there and your lighting, and it actually can be sufficient for the purposes of that as well. Especially if you're going to be doing like a matte paint and you're just going to like photo comp over it anyways, it should give you enough. So let's look at the settings. So the first area, of course, is the growth areas. It contains your density and health, and it contains the type that you want, as well as some basic size settings. So just to give you a general idea, we're just going to take our density and we'll drag it all the way up. And you'll see all of that area thickens up, right? We have more trees in that area. And there's a point at which, the more trees is not really more trees, it's just sort of like a difference in scattering, but there is a density property to that. If we take our density down a little bit, like say there, and we start dealing with health, bring our health up, and then our health down. And you see how that sparsifies it as well. So if we were to maintain a full thing here and take our density way down, there's sort of like a blend of more or less the same thing. The key difference, I think, with health is it also shrinks their size significantly as well. So the density and health factors in here, the health has seemingly a little bit of an effect on what we see as the reduce function here. And to explain the difference between height and reduce, I'm just going to show you on a gradient here. So I'm just going to pull it back and we'll take a look at this gradient. And right now I've just got a clamp node on here, and I'm going to take the clamp node and drop it down. And you notice that what we get is a sort of scale in the z-axis. So it basically just gets shorter. None of the details are missing. It's just everything is just made shorter. Whereas we switch to a clip mode and we start to reduce that, it is getting shorter, but it's also missing sort of the bottom of it. And so the dimensions, the profile of it doesn't change. So the difference here is that you get a shorter tree that feels still much like its taller friends, versus, we go back to clamp again, we get sort of short and squat, right? And so it's the profile changes. So if we get in closer to these and maybe switch up to a 2K mode so that you can see them a little bit more detailed. And there we go. And we play with the height on this. It took a little bit longer to calculate, but you see it's essentially scaling upwards, right? And if we bring it down to the minimum, we've got a lot of little green dots. So you see that almost every single green dot has something in it. So if we just set that now to a basic height, so the default height there, and we do a reduce, you notice, so we bring this down, they're getting shorter, but the base is cutting off. And you can see in some of these cases, a little extra green around the outside. So they're getting shorter, but their profile isn't really changing. And now we've got a few green dots because they went beyond the limits. So that, to my perception, at least, is what seems to be happening with the difference between height and reduce. So you can maintain sort of like a tall, thin tree and also short, thin trees, as it were, versus them all just getting shorter. So if you like sort of the thickness of them, but you want them just to be shorter, you use height. If you want them to maintain sort of their profile, as it were, and the smaller ones basically get a little bit thinner, then I would use probably the reduce. Next we have, and I'm just going to keep it in 2K. I know it takes a little bit longer to calculate, but to see this really well, it will be helpful. I'm going to switch from conifers to broadleaf. So the broadleaf, which I'll just pull back here, which is how we expect to sort of see it, you can see is more of like a noisy versus sort of like a Voronoi kind of pattern. And so you see small like tree patterns based on that, or the illusion of rather. So it's just basically noise, like a Perlin noise. And if we were to switch this up to go to large, you're going to see the canopy thicken. So the spacing that was in between them is more reduced. And if we go with large and fuzzy, which is the next larger size, we can see that the roughness of them has increased. If we go ahead and switch to our shrubs now, which is the third type, you can see our robust shrubs, which almost looks like trees, depending on how you want to perceive the scale of this terrain. And if we go to large, in that case, of course, that's going to reduce them intensity. So they get a little bit softer. And of course, the final one being small, which then starts to look like something a little bit more patchy, right? And then with just tiny little bits, and that to me reads maybe a bit more like shrubs in its base form. So basically determining scale. Now the thing is with conifers, this doesn't look quite so good if you make these changes. We can go up one where we go to large and it thickens out, and the intensity for the height also goes up significantly. So it's basically just increasing the overall width of all of them. And it's kind of like going in and adjusting things like the density and health. It doesn't have quite the same impact that it does with the other ones. So my recommendation would be to keep the conifers to small, but the other ones play with the other settings. The next section, I'll just return back to 1K so we get fast kind of calculations because we don't really need the overall details. And this is one thing that seems to be a little bit strange, is that they reduce. Sometimes I just have to go ahead and reset it, even though I didn't change it, if I switch back and forth between conifers. We're looking at the next section here where we've got avoid flows and seek flows. And so if we were to just generate some flow here, see that. And if we were to represent these as just sort of color information, if I overlap the two of those, you can see where the flow information is, all the blue here. It's just default settings, and basically default settings on the pine trees. And so all the green areas is where that exists. So if we switch back and forth here, you can see it's trying to fit within those gaps. Now, obviously, if we go to seek flows, the opposite will happen, and it will now go into the areas where the blue exists. You can see now there's much more overlap. So it's not 100% exactly there, but it's very close. If we go back into here and we take something like consolidate flows, we're not seeing a big change. Let's take it the other direction. There we go, like so. And we take a look at that. See with the consolidate flows, it's now going into many more of those areas. Whereas if we take this all the way the other direction, there's a lot more like bald areas at the very edges. So it's, I think, initially intended for the avoid flows and the consolidate flows. It's sort of like it masks off some of the lower values. It's sort of like this, where if I take a height here and I change the fall off and sort of adjust it, right, we have like a sharpness, min and max sharpness. Of course, the more we go, the less sharp it is, and the more we adjust that, the sharper it is. So that's what appears to be happening for me, is that. With the, let me just reset that. With the flows itself, if you increase this, you see the flows overall get stronger, which is more like playing with these values. We just adjust that. So we're basically just growing and shrinking that based off of saying like lower values are more influential or higher values are the more influential. So that's flows itself. Is that correct? Okay. And then the altitude min and max is pretty straightforward, or it should be fairly straightforward, right? You're choosing whether or not you want to have them in the upper areas. So if I start pulling that down, it's just a basic height adjustment. And then if you don't want them in the lower planes, of course, get that. There we go. This is a bit of a floating train, though worst lens usually floats a little bit by default. So you can get them to focus in there. So you can control your height there. And of course, slope. Slope is straightforward. It's the same as the regular slope node. You have like a min and max slope. So that's another way to sort of thin it out. And then if you want them to try and grow more on the very steep slopes, you can do that as well. But again, remember they're also based on your altitude as well as your flows. So those are already masking these things off. I'm going to up the density for this next section here so we can see it a little bit better. So with these dense like so, we're going to start playing with the patches. So if we bring the patches up, you can see that it starts to erode away at the borders of these. And if you start to go to higher levels, you're going to start to notice that you get some sparseness in some areas and some other thicker regions. So it's essentially sort of like an overlaid purlin, which is coming in and eating away at the mask that's here. We start playing with chaos. You're going to notice that that is also going to sort of erode at the edges. but it maintains the shape much more. So where patchiness will create really sparse areas and really thick areas, the chaos is just going to break up your borders of existing shapes. And then we have smooth. So if we take a look at this from the top here, let's look for something that's maybe a bit more jagged in nature, maybe this lower area here. And look at this. It's getting thicker, but it's also creating sort of rounder shapes. So I would say this is sort of like maybe a blur and contrast, and that will make these more robust, but it also makes them a little bit rounder. So that, my friends, is the Arboreal Node as it stands right now. Now, of course, we want to take this information maybe a little bit further. We want to actually use it. So what I'm going to do here is to get some color. Just going to hit the good old Voronoi here. I'm going to set that to T to make it color information, mask information. We will set our values to maximum just with a right click and then choose the maximum value. And then we'll set these to, I don't know, 40. I don't know if 40 is going to be enough. Oh, not 4. 4T. There we go. And then we'll set that to a C type. That should give us a lot of variety in there, which should be good. We're going to tell this one to be G to be the one that's visible. We're going to use that height, and we're going to get our color. So we'll go ahead and get ourselves a nice little sat map. Bloop. And choose from some green. And so, of course, you could go for some very unhealthy ones. Some brown and greens, should you desire. But let's go for something relatively healthy, like so, with some variation. And I'm paying attention to the bottom here, which is giving the sort of the camouflage look here. And I want to really define the contrast maybe a little bit more. So by pushing it down to light and darks, I get that sort of more beefy aspect. And then we'll also do like a basic soil for this. I'm going to be lazy. Like so, and we'll just do a sat map on that. And pick something that looks maybe mildly appealing. Sure, why not? And then we're going to go ahead and take this and add the tree color to it. We'll go ahead and maximize that in blend mode. And we will pull out our first mask, and you'll see that this covers mostly the top of the trees. And it just reads as being the tree mask as optional, but you'll find that the color guide gets to the very edges. So the color guide will be a better resource in that particular case. And then you can just tweak, your color variation as you need. And if I were to go ahead and switch my Arboreal node to something like broadleaf, we switch over here, I would choose maybe a more appropriate color. You can even go something that has like a lot of variety, but then tone it down with a secondary one. So here we can see some more color variety going in. So it's basically just sort of working out and mapping your ranges and making sure that everything looks decent. So that's the Arboreal node and how you can use it. Hopefully you found this interesting. Go out and try it.